Welcome to the Hollywood Scholar. I'm Jed Morgan, and there's been a lot of news and interviews from the creators of The Last of Us TV show, Craig Mazin, and the video game co-creator with him, Neil Druckmann. And some of them have been positive things, some of them have been extremely negative things, such as Neil Druckmann apparently not caring what changes Craig Mazin made to the source material, and Craig really liking that creative freedom given to him by Neil. But overall, there has been a lot of positive fan reception of this show, saying that it's one of the most accurate video game adaptations of all time, not taking into account how many changes were really made in it. I would say that this first episode, at least, that's all we have to go off of, was about 50% accurate to the video game. It's not good, it's not bad, and that's not a terrible ratio considering a lot of the other adaptations we've had in recent years, such as Rings of Power and The Witcher Blood Origin, have barely managed to scrape together a single percentage. So 50% does seem like a ton to people who are used to adaptations not doing really anything from the source material whatsoever. But they have made significant changes, no more so than the spores and the character changes for Joel and Ellie and all the other main characters. And that's because Craig Mazin has come out and said that he doesn't want them to be recreating stuff from the games. They're going to make their own stuff at every single opportunity. It's their own interpretation of it. Like with the Tess actress, that's what she said. She was not supposed to model herself after Tess. She was supposed to do her own thing. Bella Ramsey, you're not supposed to play the video games. You're supposed to be your own Ellie. And pretty much every character had that conversation with Craig, and Craig every single time told them make up their own thing. And I have a problem with that because it's the characters that make Last of Us so endearing. And the spores also are a great aspect of the game that make it so unique and so visceral in a lot of those more violent horror-like scenarios. And taking them out really hurts things. But something that I didn't notice until I saw it in one of these article titles that we'll go over in a moment is the fact that they took out all gameplay from the episode entirely. Now, gameplay, by that I just mean the actual action, the actual stuff that wasn't in cutscenes. And that's why it felt so jarring to me in certain situations where you jump from the car crash to Sarah's death. What happened to everything that happened in between there? And there were examples of that later on. What happened when Joel, Ellie, and Tess got together? Suddenly they're all the way outside the city getting stopped by that soldier. What happened to everything that happened in between there? And it's specifically because Craig Mazin and Neil took out all the gameplay aspects of it. Now, gameplay, obviously you can't show gameplay in the same sense as you would in a video game. That's not what I'm saying at all. But the action involved in that, the actual getting from point A to point B, you have to show some of that for pacing issues. You have to show that to have a cohesive pace throughout the story. That's why it felt so jarring to me, because there wasn't a cohesive scene transition through a lot of these different scenarios. And it just was really abrupt. And they specifically did that to cut out the violence. That was the motivation for that. But let's jump into the several different articles that we have and see what we've got. So this is that first article that I was talking about, how HBO's The Last of Us avoided the mistake of video adaptations. Let's only make as much violence in the story as is required. Now that's something, there's so very little violence, there's so very little action, and there are rumors, this isn't confirmed, but I heard from several people that there would only be zombies in 3 out of the 9 episodes. 3 out of 9 in a zombie apocalypse show. That seems too baffling for me to necessarily believe outright, but we'll have to see. With the pilot already including some zombies, it might be, a third of the zombies that we're going to see throughout this entire show, then the clicker episode, and then probably the finale. I hope that's not true. It's a little too crazy even for me to believe outright, but they're saying, hey, we're avoiding video game mistakes by not including violence and by not including the gameplay, which is an odd thing because the gameplay is often what make people remember it. Like with Assassin's Creed, the parkour aspect of it is a lot of what people remember from that story. And if you cut that out entirely, is it really Assassin's Creed? The Last of Us cutting out its violence for no particular reason, but to somehow break the video game curse, and taking out the gameplay, which is important for scene transitions, is a very, very odd choice. Because even with The Last of Us, you can't just watch the cutscenes and get the cohesive story. It'll feel jarring because how did they get from this point to this point? How did you do this? How did you do that? Gameplay does offer very important aspects of the story for you to have a cohesive scene-to-scene transition. Without those scenes, it's going to be incredibly jarring, and it's probably only going to get worse because the first episode adapted a lot of the cutscenes. The first episode portion of the video game had the most cutscenes out of probably the entire game. So that's why it wasn't as apparent to a lot of people. But going forward, if they're just cutting out gameplay and going from basically their versions of these cutscenes to their version of cutscenes, it's going to be so jarring. I can't imagine the pacing being much worse than what they're describing here. And this is by Craig Matheson and Neil Druckmann's own admission. So we're not off to a very good start. Now, this is an old interview apparently with Neil Druckmann talking about the original Last of Us story, but I just found it in a Fandom Wire article and I had to bring it up because it's quite strange to come up with something like this. So he says, "We haven't established why we should care about this kid," talking about Sarah. So by the time of Sarah's death, he said, "We don't have a reason to care about Sarah." I'm sorry, we don't have a reason to care about Sarah? Besides that great conversation that Joel and Sarah had on the couch that immediately established their relationship, and the mere fact that we played as Sarah for a long time, and we can kind of infer a relationship considering that it's Joel's daughter. We don't know anything about that. We care about this kid because we know this journey is about to be how important this kid is. Drunkman explained. I remember when I worked on the game, this was always the test for people. I'd be like, what's the inciting incident? They would say, when Joel's daughter Sarah dies, obviously. That is the obvious answer, because that is the inciting incident of both the zombie apocalypse and Joel becoming the hardened figure that he is. That is absolutely the inciting incident. But according to him, nope, it's when Joel runs into Ellie. That's the thing that changes his life. Yes, it begins a transitional period, but the inciting incident that makes him who he is Sarah's death. Obviously, initially, when he meets Ellie, it's not really that big of a deal. Ellie is barely more than a piece of cargo to him at that point, so it doesn't incite a whole lot within him. It's an important moment and a great moment from the video game, but he doesn't understand why the audience should care about Sarah, and he doesn't understand why they think that Sarah's death is more important to Joel than meeting Ellie. His relationship eventually with Ellie becomes vastly important, but I do not believe for 1 second that Joel believes his relationship with Ellie is more important and more inciting to who he is as a person than Sarah's death. That just shows an innate misunderstanding of the story of The Last of Us by one of the creators. Now, there's a lot of things going on with him being the creator, that there's another woman who was involved who actually wrote it before she was muscled out, and he wrote the DLC on his own, and that's why it's not very well liked by a lot of people. And then there's the other game director who's currently fighting for some recognition for the HBO series. He wasn't credited or paid royalties for it at all. So that's two significant people who Neil Druckmann shouldered out. And when he comes out with comments like this, I tend to believe the rumors that they were the creative minds and he was just kind of there. And a lot of the things that he said follow in line with that. And Last of Us Part 2 was his baby alone, and it was a disaster. A disaster. And then when you hear the rumors about Craig Matheson, very, very proud that Neil Druckmann let him do whatever he wanted with the story, telling him, hey, do whatever you want. I don't care what changes you make. Change it all if you want to. This is not the words of someone who actually cares about something he created or about someone who created something. It doesn't sound like he has any sort of attachment to this story or this universe because of all the things he said and done with Last of Us Part 2. It definitely doesn't seem like Neil Druckmann was as intricately involved as he would like people to believe for the original Last of Us. And finally, I have a few more comments from Craig Matheson that I want to talk about, specifically about some of the adaptation integrity stuff that people aren't really paying attention to, specifically with the characters and the spores. This article comes from the Washington Post. HBO's The Last of Us is a hit. The producer wants to clear the air. Now, at face value, yep, that's totally fine. It is a massive hit. As much as I didn't like it, I can't deny how many people are watching it and enjoying it so thoroughly, but he has a lot of interesting comments here, specifically about the characters of Joel and Ellie. I didn't coach Ramsey to do Ellie in the video game mannerism. I didn't coach her to do Ellie's rhythms. I didn't coach her to do anything, except inside the scenes, I wanted to know what intentions were the dialogue and in the text. Now, that's a little bit not good in its basic terms. You're not coaching her at all, except to say what the dialogue means. That's very, very surface level. What was intended in the dialogue in the text? Well, probably, hey, Joel, we need to go that way, but what does it mean for her character? If you're not coaching her at all, let alone as Ellie, that's not what a director is supposed to do. Of course, the director is supposed to direct and coach the actor to play the right version of the character. Kind of an odd thing. And going on, he said, a lot of people were worried about hearing how Ramsey didn't play the video games or was told not to. It was frustrating to know that we had people to see people doubting. Yes, people were doubting because you told your main character, one of your main characters, not to play the source material or interact with it at all. And a lot of the other actors have come out and said similar things. Yes, that is a major red flag. And I still believe it is a problem for the show because these characters do not resemble their game counterparts in the slightest. So yes, it is a problem. It is a major red flag, especially in the modern day when you have a lot of bad examples of people doing the same thing, specifically Jodie Whittaker in the role of the Doctor, told not to engage with the past, didn't engage with the past, and then didn't play the doctor whatsoever because you didn't know what the doctor was. Same thing with this. And he's just, oh man, people are upset that I'm making bad decisions. That's so sad. It's our job, it's Neil's job and my job to put Ellie and Joel on the page. We know Ellie and Joel completely. It doesn't seem like it because the Joel and Ellie in the TV show are not the Joel and Ellie from the video game. And he even goes on to admit it in a moment here. He and I created these new versions. These aren't Joel and Ellie. He talks about it a lot. This is an adaptation where he doesn't really take much from the video games in terms of the characters. He wants their own interpretations of it. He wants these new versions of it. And that's why they don't resemble their game counterparts. They aren't the same character. They've got the names in common and the costuming in common. And people were saying, oh, he's wearing the same costume, so it's an accurate adaptation. No, the costume doesn't mean anything. The Assassin's Creed movie had similar costumes to the video games, but no one considers that an accurate adaptation because it was awful. Costume isn't proof. That's something that has baffled me with this, is the whole costuming thing is proof. But he admits they're not the same character, and that's a big problem for me. And lastly, there's this big conversation going on with the Spores currently. A lot of fans, even of the show and the really big stand type figures, were a little bit disappointed when it was news came out that the Spores would not be included, because that's a big part of the games. And the showrunner came out and said, yeah, we're going to do tendrils instead, have spaghetti come out of people's mouths as zombies to stab you, and that's how you get infected, which is really weird. And then he had comments about how he didn't believe the spores were realistic. He said that he thought the entire world would get decimated by the spores in like immediately, so there's no way that it could be 20 years later, forgetting how fungus works. Funguses are driven back by the sun. That's pretty basic biology. So only the dark places underground were really filled with these spores. And that's what we see representative in the games. So it makes sense. The spores still make sense. And they're funguses. They put out spores. That's a real thing. So he's already being very disingenuous, but partially with the backlash from the people who even like the show and the stand type figures, he's come out and said this. It was less, oh, the spores don't work, even though you said the spores don't work, because I have to say, you may see spores yet. So he's kind of back and tracking a little bit and saying, oh, in season 2, there might be spores. But at this point, you can't have spores come into it because it doesn't make sense. After 20 years, why haven't the funguses put out spores yet? It's too late. It is too late. You can't retroactively include them and expect it to make any sort of logical sense. It's not so much that they can't exist in this world. It was really more like when a character is transmitting this to another character, what do we do is slightly different than just chomp. The spores are different than just chomp. So you've already got that. And the tendrils are just weird. It's not just, oh, it's different than just a chomp. We're stabbing you with spaghetti out of our mouths. It's not just, oh, we're different. Oh, we're different. And so that was his big claim to that. And on Twitter, people are freaking out about this, saying, oh my God, the spores might be in season 2. See, it is accurate. It is accurate. This is proof that he actually does care. This is proof that it is accurate. And it's baffling to me because he's admitted that he's changing it a lot, that Neil doesn't care what he changes, and the superficial aspect of episode 1, getting some visuals correct, and those were the visuals that I really liked. Those were the parts of episode 1 that I did like, is when they got those accurate to the video game. But everyone is saying, oh my God, he's so accurate, and even the stuff that he changes will be accurate later, and it's just not as good of an adaptation as people seem to believe it is. I'm firmly with that 50%. I think that 50% is pretty fair for episode 1, but what we've seen of the series going forward, it's going to start declining from that 50% rather sharply, especially episode 3, which is apparently entirely made up and is apparently like a flashback sequence with Bill and his boyfriend. It's going to be a weird deal where it's not from the video games at all. And even if it isn't a flashback, his partner is dead by the time we get to him in the video game. So it's going to be completely different. That 50% may be the best that we get so far. But these are some interesting comments by the showrunners, the creators of both The Last of Us video game and the show, and makes me even more concerned about the show going forward than I actually already am. I do believe the other shoe will drop at some point, at least by the end of the series, because Last of Us Part 2 is something that they are pushing towards, and that is a disaster of a video game, a disaster of a story that destroys Ellie, Joel's character, the world building, because now everybody's immune, and a whole lot of terrible things, no worse than the character of Abby herself. And I'm just not looking forward to how the series ends, because at some point, it'll turn into crap. At some point, it has to, because it's setting up Part 2. So rather sooner rather than later, but it's going to happen at some point, and I am certain that I'm going to be proven right that the show overall is not as good as people seem to believe it is, but I am happy that people are enjoying it for the time being, at least. But anyway, that's all I have for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Anon.
Hey, yo, are you feeling what I'm doing up in here? Oh, I know you are. Do you miss all the good, compelling stories that we used to get back in Hollywood that they ain't putting down no more? I know you missing it. So check out my book series, Odyssey of a Phoenix, a mythological epic about philosophy, morality, and modern day mental illness issues, baby. Book 1, Down in Flames. Book 2, Apocalypse Then. These are currently on sale. What are you waiting for? Get your hands on them. And we got Book 3, Kill the Dark, is coming down the pipeline. Just wait for all the good stuff that's dropping. You ain't gonna be disappointed, fam.